All right, well, I guess we don't need to tell you our names, since Sheila already has. Our firm, Endeavor Law Group, was founded, I don't know, about 12 years ago?
12 years.
12 years ago now, with the idea that we would focus on working with startups. And so I know many of our colleagues thought, what? There is not enough startup business, right, in Eugene to sustain your firm. But in fact, for 12 years, there has been plenty of startup activity in Eugene, and it's been really cool to see how the momentum has really increased just in the last couple of years, and to see all the stuff that's going on in Eugene. So as Sheila mentioned, we're here tonight to talk about equity-based compensation, right? And so what do we mean by that? What we mean is paying people, right, whether they're employees or they're outside service providers, with some sort of ownership interest in your company. And so we know lots of startups are interested in paying people with equity, and there are some really good reasons for doing that. One, when you're starting up, we realize companies rarely have the funds to pay people market rate, right, for their services. And so often what we see is that people compensate employees and other service providers by sort of making up the difference between what they can actually afford to pay them and market rate by giving them some ownership interest in their company. Great reason to do that. Another reason why you might compensate with people with equity, frankly, is to align the long-term interests of your service providers with your company, right? So if you pay somebody compensation, that's an immediate benefit. If instead you give them an ownership interest in your company, then you're incentivizing them to work hard for the company, right? Because the company does well, then they should do well also. I think you were going to mention a couple of bad reasons for doing that.
Well, primarily one bad reason. So those are good reasons. Here is one really bad reason to pay equity-based comp, and that is to pay equity in lieu of no cash. Okay, so
Right, to pay all equity.
all equity,
Yeah.
because that would be a violation of federal and state minimum wage and overtime laws. The federal government does have an exemption for 20% or greater owners that are actively engaged in the business. And if you pass that test, then perhaps you can do the no pay for those 20% of us. However, we're sitting here in the state of Oregon, and Oregon's law is actually more strict. So in the area of wage and hour, you always go with the more strict. That's just the way it lands. And in Oregon, they have that same 20% exemption. However, they didn't adopt the federal government's law entirely. They said you still have to have a salary-based test. So if you're 20% or above actively engaged in business, you still have to pay a minimum salary level to be considered exempt from minimum wage and overtime. And that salary level today, and it goes up periodically, is I believe $455 a week. Any questions on that issue? Oh, by the way, did you mention?
Right, so I guess I forgot to
All
mention
throughout,
early
just-
go. Feel free to jump in with questions, right, whenever you have them, instead of waiting for the end, because sometimes questions just make more sense in context. So there are really two basic forms of equity-based compensation. One is an outright grant, and the other one is an option. Yep, Tad, you had a question?
Real quick, so that's, I assume you're talking about the minimum wages for employees, right?
Right.
So for contractors are free to make a contract saying, I will work for this amount of equity in exchange for my work without being paid.
It's a good question, Ted. If in fact they are truly independent contractors, and interestingly enough, the next presentation we're doing is on independent contractors employees. But if they meet the requirements of being truly an independent contractor, and a lot of people abuse this, but assuming they meet that, then no, they're not subject to minimum wage and hours and overtime.
Yeah.
Good question.
So when you said the 455, is that before or after taxes?
That's just gross, yeah.
Okay, so back to two forms of ways you might compensate with people equity, right? One is just an outright grant, right? So I company give you service provider equity in exchange for your services, right? And you typically do it as some sort of award or a bonus. So no cash payment is required, right? The employees or service providers, in fact, are paying you with their future services. And the benefit of doing it that way, frankly, is the employee immediately has ownership interest in your company, right? They immediately have ownership interest. They haven't had to come out of pocket with any cash. The other way to get people equity is to grant them an option. So an option isn't an outright grant of an ownership interest. Instead, it's a contract between the employee and the service provider, where the company, the company and the service provider, where the company says, I give you, the service provider, the right to buy an ownership interest, and it's at a set price and it's over a set period of time. So a service provider doesn't immediately have equity, but they have the right to buy in later. And they buy in at typically the exercise price of an option has to be the fair market value of whatever that ownership interest is on the date of grant. So presumably, people will wait and see how the company does, and then if the company's doing better over time, they might exercise later, and they're going to exercise at a lower price. Although the company doesn't have equity right away, it doesn't give them the ability to sort of take a wait and see approach.
So,
Are either of those more difficult administratively to do, or are they about the same?
I would guess that the options are a little more
Complicated.
administrative. It depends on how big the option pool is, though. Let's say you're just doing it with a couple of folks. I don't think that's any harder to administer. Now, we'll get in later these different kinds of options. There's really, two different kinds. The tax code, one's called an incentive stock option. That's a word of art in the tax code. A lot of people call it an ISO. The other one's an NSO, non-qualified stock option. And those issues could come up in those distinctions, but when you're dealing with an ISO plan, it does get fairly complicated. Okay, but just the grant of a couple of non-qualified options to a couple of key folks is not going to be any more burdensome than doing the grants.
Let me talk about vesting a little bit.
Okay, so typically, whether it's a grant or an option, you almost always see it subject to some kind of vesting schedule. Are you guys familiar with vesting? Yes? Yes, good. So vesting it's important because vesting is what ties the employee to stay, right? That's the incentive. If you will stay over a certain period of time, you will get the true full value of this grant, okay? So there's two basic types of vesting schedules that you see out there. The world is kind of an unlimited universe, but there's the two basics. One is what I call like a staggered grant, and that is, I grant you the right to 5% interest, soccer, LLC, if you'll here 12 months. And if you're here 24 months, I'll give you another 5%. And if you're here 36 months, I'll give you another 5%. That's sort of a staggered grant. The other way to vest, which later you'll see, which I think is a better way to do it, is what we call reverse vesting. And that is, I'll give you everything that I want to give you. Let's say it's 100 shares of stock. I give it to you all up front. And then I subject that to what they call risk of forfeiture. And that is, if you leave, say within that first year, okay, all of it will be forfeited. If you leave before the end of the second year, you'll forfeit 75% of it. This is just sort of a typical way to go. If you leave in the following year, you'll forfeit 50% of it. So we'll deal with later. This is really a tax reason why that is more beneficial. But a lot of people will come to us with this staggered grant. I don't think it's a good way to go. We'll deal with it in a little bit. Question?
I was just kind of speculating if it also gives them a sense of ownership over all of it, and like it's being given back rather than not owned.
Does the employee feel like that's a greater sense of ownership? I suppose they do, yeah, because they're getting it all up front.
Right.
Yeah.
So in talking about equity compensation tonight, what we're really going to talk about are two legal issues, right? So tax, which David is mostly going to cover, and securities law, which I'm going to cover. We're covering those areas because, frankly, these are two areas where we see businesses most commonly make mistakes. So I've lost my place now. Before David goes into kind of a deep dive into the tax stuff, I'm just going to give you a little overview of securities laws. And so lots of companies, in fact, are pretty surprised to find out that securities laws even apply when they're granting equity to employees, right? And so securities laws apply both at the federal and the state level whenever you are selling securities, right? So in this instance, with equity compensation, the laws say that a sale occurs because even with an option or with an outright grant of equity, employee isn't paying in cash. In fact, what they're paying for their equity with is services, right? So their promise to perform services, in fact, is a payment that makes this constitute a sale.
And so it's sort of an investment decision right there.
Right,
Will I
Right.
continue to work for that equity?
right. And then it's security because generally, all right, there's some nuance to this, but generally, if you're granting an ownership in your business, whether that's a ownership interest in your LLC or stock in your corporation or frankly option in a corporation or an LLC, all those things are considered securities under the securities laws. And so, as I said, securities laws apply at both the federal and the state level. Luckily, they both have two basic requirements. So requirement one is if you are going to grant equity to employees, you either have to register your offer and sale of those equity grants. And that's registry at both the federal level with the Securities and Exchange Commission and at the state level. So the state, the state where each of your employees or service providers resides. Or you structure the offer and sale in reliance on some exemption from registration. So for small startup company, registration with the SEC is just never going to make sense. Frankly, registration with the states, I think, doesn't entirely make sense. And so in our jobs, we're usually helping companies structure their grant of equity in reliance on some exemption from registration under securities laws. And then the second requirement is that you make disclosure to these service providers about just what the heck it is they're getting in exchange for their services, right? So you want to tell them the characteristics of the security that they're getting. You want to tell them about the company and its history and its competition, sort of the whole background. Again, so as David said, so that they can really make an informed investment decision. Do I, in fact, want to perform services for your company in exchange for some equity in your company? Although not everybody does this disclosure in written form, certainly we recommend it be in written form because then you've got some record of exactly what you've told people.
And so what does that entail? What do you have to tell them?
As I said, there's usually a section where you talk about if you're granting stock, here are all the rights and obligations attached to the stock, right? Or if it's an LLC ownership interest, here are the rights and ownership interests or rights and obligations involved in that. And here's a copy, for example, of our operating agreement, or in the case of a corp, right, articles and bylaws and shareholder agreement, whatever you might have. But it's also about the company. So what is it? What's the history of the company? Luckily with startups, the history is pretty darn short, right? So there's not a lot to say there. What's your industry? What are your plans? What's your competition? What are the trends? If you have some historical financial results, you include those. If you have pro forma financials, so you have some projections about how you think the company would do. Usually investors expect to see some projections. Along with, I advise, lots of disclaimers about these are our best guess, right? But we can't guarantee that we're going to achieve those results. Essentially, enough information that someone could really make an informed investment decision. Adam, you got a question?
Filing fees, and do you all of a sudden then suddenly become in a different category as far as the SEC is concerned and have to like do stuff?
Yeah, great question. So you're leading right into my next thing. So on the registration from exemption side, there are really two common ones that we see available for equity grants. The first one is called the intrastate offering exemption. So the SEC has said, for example, if you're an Oregon company and your principal place of business is in Oregon, and you do the vast majority of your business in Oregon, and all your employees or service providers are in Oregon, then God bless you, right? The SEC doesn't care. Frankly, just make sure that you meet those requirements. You don't have to register, you don't have to file anything. The SEC says, frankly, then that's just up to that state, right? And then in Oregon, there's an exemption that says, if you're going to grant equity to no more than 10 people in any 12-month period, then again, you're exempt from registration. So at both the federal and the state level, for that particular exemption, No filing required, no filing fee. It's up to you later on if challenged for some reason to show, but look, we really are an Oregon company and we did all these things, right? We didn't bring in more than 10 people in 12 months. But as long as you can show that you've complied with those exemptions, again, if ever challenged, you're sort of fly under the radar, right? Because you don't have to file anything. Now, sometimes a company says, I've got employees or service providers in other states, right? Or I want to grant equity to more than 10 people in 12 months, so that's not going to work for me. Instead, what we use in that case is an SEC rule called Rule 701. So the SEC has said, if you're going to grant equity to people and you're going to do it pursuant to either a written compensatory benefit plan, like a stock incentive plan, for example, if you're a corporation, or you have some written compensatory contract with your service provider, and you don't grant more than $1 million worth of equity in any year, then again, you're exempt from registration, no filing required, right? I mean, the SEC doesn't really even know you exist, or that you're granting that equity. In Oregon, there's a companion rule to 701 that says, hey, if you're going to grant equity in reliance on Rule 701, then again, you're exempt in Oregon, but we will require you to make a filing and pay a filing fee. The filing is pretty dang simple. The filing fee is not very large. It's based on the dollar amount of equity you want to issue. And so, yes, there'd be a filing in Oregon, but it doesn't otherwise really change much. And what I have learned is that they process that filing pretty darn quickly and will send you an order and say, right, you're good to go for another year, you're free to grant equity as long as you comply with those requirements. So it doesn't really, it doesn't make you into a public company. It doesn't change your status or make you subject to any other requirements. So there are lots of exemptions from registration. We had just found that those two work particularly well with small businesses and with startups. The other thing that people often ask is, man, it sounds like a lot of trouble, right? I'm just starting up, and I just want to grant equity to these two key people. And frankly, I don't feel like doing that whole rigmarole, right? That sounds like a lot of work, that written disclosure that you told me I have to make, and I have to make sure that I comply with these certain requirements, and maybe I've got people in other states, so now I'm going to have to do that 701 thing. And that just sounds like a pain, and why would I even do that? And so I think there are three good reasons, frankly, why you should. One is that if you ever have an employee or a service provider who ends up being a little disgruntled for whatever reason, they in fact, they have to get legal advice to realize that they have some recourse here, but they could go to the Oregon Securities Division and complain that your company sold unregistered securities without an exemption and registration. And then you could be investigated by the Securities Division, and they could impose fines and penalties. So a number of years ago, we had a client come to us after the fact, right, after they already granted equity. They did have employees who were disgruntled and complained. They had like $40,000 in fines and penalties. So not a happy day for something that I think wouldn't have required a lot of expense to comply with. Second reason is that on the disclosure end, so if you don't make disclosure to people, or your disclosure is misleading in some way, like you've left out some big important thing that people would find material to an investment decision, or you've, glossed over something that's less than favorable about the company, again, and the employee or the service provider ends up unhappy, and the company doesn't do as well as everyone had hoped, so that they can claim, boy, my equity now is not even worth the value of the services I put in. In fact, they have recourse against the company. They can sue the company to get their investment back, plus some interest. They can also reach through the either corporate or LLC shield that you put up. This is one area where you're not protected, and reach the executive management of the company. So in a corp, that means the directors and executive officers, and an LLC, that means the managers and executive officers. So this is one area where you don't have a shield from personal liability, but in fact can be held liable to investors. And then the third reason, and frankly, sometimes people just find this the most compelling, is if you later go out and do a fundraising round, right? You're looking for outside investment from folks. Typically, those investors will do their due diligence about the company, right? To decide whether or not they want to invest. And I think the more sophisticated the investor, the more they will ask about your securities law compliance. They'll see that you've got employees or outside service providers as members of your LLC or as shareholders in your corp. And they'll ask, so how did you do that? What exemption did you rely on? What disclosure did you make to them? What does your agreement with them look like? And so if they think that you've got a lot of exposure, that may make them a little less willing to invest. So I think if you do that right in the early go, and again, it's not terribly expensive in the early go, it'll set you up well when you go out to raise funds from investors.
Any questions for Catherine? I'm just curious.
I know that was a lot of info, and that was sort of the overview. There's of course some nuance to that, but those are the general parameters. Yep, Adam?
Could you repeat that?
Yeah.
Just kidding.
Very nice.
Okay, so I'm the tax guy, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 5 basic tax principles that apply to this area of executive or equity-based comp. And then we're going to apply those principles to the basic types of equity that we see in our practice that people are using. So, here are the 5 basic tax principles. Number 1, the transfer of equity is a taxable event to the service provider. We see a lot of people will come in, oh yeah, I gave equity to this person, that person, that person, and didn't get much advice on the front end, and they're always surprised to learn that actually, more often than not, is going to be a taxable event to that service provider.
Not generally a happy day for service provider, right? Great, I've got equity, and now I owe income tax, but you gave me no cash with which I can pay the income tax.
Second basic principle, that tax will be equal to the value of that interest as of the date of the transfer. So if the value of those shares of stock or LLC interest are $5,000, the tax will be $5,000 due April 15 in the year after you did that transfer. Here's a little exception to that though. This is number 3. Vesting delays the tax debt. But here's the bad part about that. It also delays the valuation date. So if you're in a fast growth potential company, you're assuming that the value tomorrow will be worth a lot more than it is today. So yes, you could delay the tax till the equity is fully vested. Or and we're going to deal with it in a bit, we will try to accelerate the tax day actually and be taxed all today because we're hoping that value is the lowest value we're going to see.
Is that value taxed as ordinary income or?
Yes. Okay. So yeah, I grant you interest worth $5,000, compensation income. So subject to Social Security and that stuff as well.
And this is the person who's receiving the equity.
Yeah, this whole area of equity-based comp, all the bad news is to the recipient, which is really always not. The recipient rarely knows this. They're thinking, yeah, this is great. I got some equity.
Wait, if the recipient has to pay Social Security, what about the Social Security tax to the employer?
Yeah, got to pay it on the grant. Okay, and the employer. Okay, we're jumping ahead. Hold on until I get to the taxes. Okay. But the employer gets an offset. If the employee is paying tax on it, general rule, the employer gets a deduction. So in the case of we granted him $5,000 worth of stock, he had to report $5,000 of compensation income. The employer got a deduction for paying $5,000 of compensation.
Harold, you got a question?
Would that be a 1099 or what would the?
No, 1099 is what you give to an independent contractor. You're thinking about 83B, right? And that's next.
So the
Kinda,
company would just issue a W-2 for this.
pardon me?
The company would just issue a W-2 to the service provider,
Yeah.
as you put it?
Yeah. No, it's not 1099. That's for independent contractors. Okay, here's another problem with vesting. It delays the start of the long-term capital gain holding period. You know, some of you have been to some of our other talks, we've talked about long-term capital gain versus ordinary income. Long-term capital gain general rule, this isn't exclusive, but let's say it's 20% rate at the highest tax brackets, 20% on long-term capital gain, 38% ordinary income. So it's a substantial difference, right? So you'd like to get long-term capital gain. In order to get long-term capital gain, you have to hold that equity for at least a year. You have to own it and hold it. So if you have a vesting schedule, it also delays it delays the start of the running of that 1 year. Okay, so go ahead.
So you mean 100% or at 50%? 50% is fully vested and not that.
Excellent question. No, as each unit or share vests, then it's those 10 shares that vest in year one are fully vested, and then if you had 100 share grant, those 90 still remain unvested. Okay. So what you like to do is accelerate both of those. Okay, you want to be taxed today. Sounds counterintuitive, and you want to start that long-term holding company, long-term capital gain holding period, in order to, because in a fast growth company, which is what we're talking about today, you're hoping that it's going to go this way with your investment. So how do you get there? There's a thing, and several people have asked me about this recently, called an 83B election. So 83B is a section of the Internal Revenue Code. If you file an 83B election, you accelerate the tax date, so you're taxed today rather than when it's fully vested, and you also start the long-term capital gain holding period by filing that 83B election. Here's the rub, though. The 83B election only applies to a present transfer. Okay? That means that it does not apply to options, for instance, because option isn't a present transfer. What an option is a right to buy stock in the future. So you can't file an 83B election on an option. Okay? You also can't file an 83B election on what I call the staggered grant. I give you 5% at the end of 12 months. I give you another 5 at the end of 24. Because again, that is I will. So that's not a present transfer. Where an 83B election will apply, and that's why I like reverse vesting, is where you give them everything up front and you say I could take it back from you if you don't stay the period of time. That's called reverse vesting. That's also called under the tax code substantial risk of forfeiture. And the 83B election does apply to that because I'm giving it to you all today, even though I have the right to take it back.
So that's a taxable event when you give it all today.
Yes. We actually want the taxable event.
But then how does that happen if it gets taken away from you?
Oh, that's the bite, okay? Part of that. If in fact you file an 83B election and you later forfeit those interests, you just took that risk. That's a great question. And you won't get that back. There's no offset to that.
So you pay tax on something that you don't have.
Yeah.
I apologize. So is the choice to have a staggered grant or reverse vesting, is that the choice of the employer or the service provider?
It's always the employer's choice. Okay, so, well, I say that. A lot of times you might be in a negotiation with somebody, right? But I would say that the 99% of the time the employer lays out, here's what I'm willing to give you. Here's the vesting schedule, reverse vesting schedule, right? And I'm recommending that you never do that staggered grant because you can't file an 83B election. And so what the problem is, then in the staggered grant, 12 months comes by, they invest for 25%. The value, the tax is now on what it's worth a year from now.
Right.
And then in that next vesting period, it's what it's worth 2 years from now.
Understanding the benefits and risks of reverse vesting, it sounds like the employer has to offer that, but also the service provider must then file the
Yeah, the duty is on the employee service provider, doesn't have to be an employee, to file the 83B election. And that election has to be filed within 30 days of the transfer and no excuses for going over it. They just won't take it. They're very strict with this. So you have to file with the IRS where you send your usual tax information to. And then again, you actually you attach that, whatever you filed then, within the 30 days to your tax return in April, and you file it again. Okay?
Yeah, it seems like you got two different audiences here. There's the employer and the service provider. And so it's a little confusing. What you were talking about is everything the employer should do.
Right.
And you're talking about everything that the service provider should do. But really, it's the employer who's going to come to you and ask for advice. So should the employer kind of lay this all out, make it clear to the service provider that this is the implications of.
Well, that's a great point. That actually goes to Catherine's point of disclosure. Okay, so,
Telling people
so
here,
we
right
tell
here are the
people.
characteristics attached to what I'm giving you.
Right.
And so, although certainly these tax considerations are employee, service provider considerations,
Yeah.
in fact, right, it's in the company's best interest to give their service providers a good tax day.
Yeah, I think you raised an excellent point, but actually, even though the risk is on the employee, this area of equity-based comp is all about the employer wants it to be a good day for the employee. If it's a bad day for this employee, it's a bad day for the employer because they assume that person might be upset and leave.
Well, and then the whole incentive just disappears, right?
So we do disclose it. We'll say, okay, if you take this interest, you need to file an 83B, or we don't say you need to. We'll say you should consider filing an 83B election for representing the company.
Right, go
Right.
get some advice from your accountant, the time, and then we usually say for our clients, the time is short, you got 30
Very
days.
short, you got
right?
30
Go get some
days.
advice.
And frankly, in a fast growth potential type of companies, the kind of companies we're typically talking around here at the Fertility Lab, I cannot think of a reason why you wouldn't file that 83B election. However, you do take some risk, as he points out, that if you end up forfeiting it, well, you lost on that. But hopefully, you've only lost on what was the lowest value you could have paid on in the early go. Okay. So now let's walk through some of the. Any other questions on that?
I just want, so the 83B, is that something that your accountant would file, or is that something that your lawyer would file?
Either.
Either one.
We typically suggest that we're more often than not we're representing the startup who's offering this compensation. We in the letter we prepare for our client to give to their employee, we say you should go talk to your accountant or your lawyer and have them do this for you. Okay. There's what's weird
Well,
is
and
there's
frankly, it's not unheard of for us to prepare the 83B election and give it to the company and say, give this to your employee, and have them go talk to someone to get their own advice about whether or not they should file it.
and it's weird because there's really no standard form. I mean, you
No,
can't
it's
go and
not.
look it up and go, okay, where's the 83B election?
If tax code just says, under section 83B, you should do this, you should tell us this, 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 and this.
It lays out what you should state, okay? But there's no form you could go get. Oh, here's my 83B election.
Should you ever offer your services
Pardon me?
for an equity position?
Oh, do we?
Yeah.
We do not, as a general rule. And there's reasons we could talk about that. We try to not get into that sort of conflict.
No, conflict of interest,
Yeah.
right, for us. Yep.
In cases where an employee would have some taxable event, do employers or can employers include a compensation for that amount of taxable event? Say, well, here's a grant, but by the way, it will also include this, so that no harm, no foul at the end of the year when you get a file or something like that. Is that?
Actually, it's a good point. Actually, I have seen people with it's called grossing it up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that is, you're going to have a tax hit on this, and I doubt that any employer is going to, hold you harmless for not having filed the 83B election on timely. That's your problem. But it's all a negotiation, right? Hey, I don't have to take a tax hit, so I'll need a little more compensation. Now, in startup land, there's not a lot of extra money to go around usually, though. So I don't see a lot of startups doing the gross up. I have seen more mature companies do gross ups. But there's not much cash in startup land. Was there something else? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to go through 4 different types of equity grants we see frequently in our practice. That's profits interest in an LLC, stock grants in a corporation, and 2 different types of stock options, as I talked about earlier. NSOs, non-qualified stock option, ISO, incentive stock option. I'm going to walk through, hit the tax points, interrupt me at any time. So, profits interest in LLC, I love them, okay? And the reason is,
All the time, right?
and the reason is you could grant somebody equity through this device, and if it's done correctly, there shouldn't be any present taxation on that grant. Okay? And here's why. here's what a profits interest is. It's an interest in the future appreciation and profits of the company. It's not a share of what the value of the company is on the date that you grant them that interest. So if the company is worth $100,000, what the company does is it allocates it. That's what they call book up the capital accounts. So it allocates that $100,000 to the existing members. Says that's your capital account, and the profit center person gets a capital account of 0. Okay, and the IRS has perfectly signed off on this, saying, well, I think you gave this person nothing, and the reason is if I sell this tomorrow and that value is correct, so let's say that 100,000. So tomorrow I sell for 100,000.
Go around here.
Then this person I gave that interest to gets 0. Okay? Now, then you think, well, what's the benefit then? Well, the benefit is, in the long run, in a startup where you're looking at fast growth, is it's going to appreciate. In addition, you're going to share in current profit distributions, voting. You get this full membership type of interest. But what you don't get is the value as it started. For those who know about stock appreciation rights, things like that, it's sort of like that, okay? You forgo what exists today. A way to look at that economically, perhaps you didn't contribute to what existed today. And so going to aligning interest as you move forward in my employee, you're going to contribute going forward and you're going to fully participate in what you built with us.
Tad, you have a question?
So when you say profit, you don't mean net sales. What you mean is
Yeah.
the delta between the company's valuation at the time of the stock and the time it was sold out.
Yeah, it's an excellent point because they call it a profits interest. I do think it's kind of the wording is. I wish it could come up
It's
with a different.
misleading.
Because it indicates that I'm only going to give you a share of our profits. That's not what it means.
Right. So
It's a
this
share
is
of the increase in valuation of the
Appreciated
shares.
value and the profits going forward.
right. So often just seeing the numbers helps me. Right. So let's say you've got founders who started an LLC for their business, right? And together the founders have put in, we'll use David's number, $100,000. Right? So they've invested $100,000 in the company. What they've gotten,
Or even they invested $5,000, but it's worth $100,000.
right.
But their current investments were $100,000.
Their current investment is worth $100,000. So what they've gotten for their investment is called a capital interest, right, as opposed to a profits interest. They have a capital interest in the company, right, which means that they frankly share in everything that the company does, right, because they're the only owners. Now let's say you bring in an employee, your first employee, and you want to grant that employee some equity in the company, right? So you grant him, I don't know, let's say a 5% ownership interest in your company. If you grant that as a capital interest, as you did the founders, then employee is going to have, right, 5% is going to have presumably a $5,000 tax day, right? They've got something worth $5,000, they're going to go, oh, income tax on $5,000, right? That's the typical grant.
Plus payroll taxes from both sides.
Yes, yeah. If instead you grant him a profits interest, right, again, 5%, right? So you grant him a 5% profits interest. Instead of the IRS considering that 5% to be worth $5,000, in fact, they consider it to be worth 0. So as David said, so of course the advantage to the employee is today, when I get the profits interest, I have no tax, right? Because the idea is it's worth nothing. So this is fictional, but let's say a company did this, and let's say for whatever reason the company dissolved the very next day, right? The next day after granting this profits interest. And presumably the company's worth $100,000. Well, okay, so let's say the company's sold, right? It has $100,000 in proceeds. That $100,000 in proceeds goes only to the founders, right? Because they've got this $100,000 capital interest in the company. Employee who just got the profits only interest the day before, so has contributed nothing yet, right? In exchange for his equity, gets nothing, right? And so that makes some economic sense. Of course, as the company continues to appreciate in value, then this profits only interest is going to appreciate. It's going to go from 0 to whatever. So let's say the company sells, I don't know, down the line, right? Let's say the company sells for, I don't know, a couple $1 million. And I'm simplifying this just for purposes of our discussion here, but in general, think of it this way. In this $2 million of proceeds that the company now has to distribute to its owners, the founders will participate in that first $100,000. The employee with the profits only interest won't. So after the founders get their $100,000 back, then the employee will share in the rest of the proceeds to the extent of his ownership interest.
Now, during this period, as you grew to the new valuation,
Right.
you also get 5% of the interim profits during that period?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So as I said, it's more complicated than that, but I think the simple way to look at it is that employee just doesn't, as David said, get to participate in the value of the company as it exists on the day that he got that interest. Is this making sense?
What if it sells the next day for 200,000?
Well, then
Well,
that
that would be great.
valuation was, well, if it happened, okay, that's a
Oh,
great
well,
point.
if it happened
Actually, then
next
that
day.
meant that the valuation wasn't very good. And this person would probably get hit on ordinary income tax, right? Well, first he wouldn't have had the holding period, right? For long-term capital gains, so it'd be ordinary anyway. But that meant the valuation wasn't very good. You would hate to do that and sell it the next day. You'd want it. If you're looking at a liquidity event on the horizon within the next, say, 6 months, I would not grant a profits interest.
But in that example, we would have got 5,000, right?
Yeah.
5,000.
It would have been hit.
An extra
Right.
100,000.
Yep.
You would have had a windfall.
And they're going to tax you on that windfall then, right? They're going to say, no, you didn't, it wasn't.
From the employee standpoint, it's a great deal because they didn't have to stay very long.
Well, yeah, but they're also paying ordinary income on that. It's, believe me, I think it's better to try to get that holding period, right? And get that long-term capital gain. Ordinary income, again, is, if you're in a company that's sold for a big number, you're looking at probably 38% federal plus 9% state. Okay.
So for this example, say they were granted 5% of the 100K, and then 2 years later, it was a valuation at $2 million.
Mhm.
So then the 100,000 gets backed out, so he gets 5% of 1.9 million, and he doesn't get hit with a long.
That's right.
But does he have short term or long term?
Long-term. Because if you did it, you said you held it for 2 years.
Right.
Now,
But you don't
which
get
is
that if
interesting
they
you
sell
said
it.
that. I like that, the fact you said that. It gives me a point to raise here in the taxes. On this profits interest, the IRS has a ruling out that says, if you don't dispose of it within 2 years, we won't, you know, we're gonna be fine, okay? We're not gonna try to come back and mess with your valuation, all right? However, you know, there's still because the long-term long-term capital gain holding period is really only 1 year. Now, that doesn't mean that that's their ruling position, what they call a safe harbor. That doesn't mean that you couldn't challenge that, okay? But best to hold on to a profits interest for 2 years if you don't want any challenge for the IRS. And you really get the long-term capital gain. Any other questions? Yes, Adam.
So in a situation like this where it's an LLC and there's no employees,
Mhm.
members exist and they basically take draws from the LLC. In a situation like this, at the point when that, let's say he's a contractor, not an employee, has his 5% piece, if the company was going to do a distribution, at that point it would be the founders 47.5, and then 5% to the other member.
Yeah, current profit distributions are, that person holding the 5% interest will get the current at that percent.
Okay.
You know, I think we've mentioned before, and we're dealing with percentages here because it's a little easier with these small numbers. I hate percentages. I'd rather do it in units, you know, in stock numbers because people get locked on percentages, but that's correct. So holding period then, right? Okay, so there's no tax to the employee on the date of the grant. And so let's say you subject it to vesting, right? Reverse vesting, right? Well, interesting thing, the IRS has come out with rulings a few years back saying that, you know, you don't even have to file an 83B election in this scenario. We will treat the date of the grant as tax day, and a long-term capital gain holding period will start to run on that day. But here's the caveat: you better have done it 100% right. So here's what every good tax lawyer will tell you: file the 83B election. Okay, just as what they call protective. So, okay, last tax issue on this profits interest. No deduction for the company, right, for granting this type of interest. Why? Well, they didn't give them anything. They're going to value it at nothing, and the employee pays no tax, and the company has no offsetting deduction. That makes sense, right? Okay, let's talk about stock grants. So a grant, we're in a corporation then, right? We're leaving LLC land. And in my view, you know, in the LLC, the only real type of equity type of compensation to consider is profits interest. You can do, there are other things you can look at, but nothing's gonna get you to the, you know, where a profits interest will get you. Okay? So let's look at a stock grant, very similar to what Catherine's outlined here. But when I, the company, transfer stock to an employee for his or her services, in this scenario, that person's going to have an immediate tax day of $5,000, right? In this scenario. Because I granted them that interest, that was the value on that day. Okay? Now, I could defer that, right, by vesting it. But again, I think that's a bad, you know, and everybody, you should vest it, okay, reverse vesting. That's great for the company. But the employee, in most cases, should be filing that 83B election to accelerate the tax day, pay the $5,000, and start the long-term capital gain holding period on day one. Okay. Oh, I should say, so you've heard this term restricted stock. Anybody heard that term? So basically what that means, this is the concept we just discussed. And the idea of restricted stock, well, it has some restrictions, right? The primary one, vesting, right? A lot of restricted stock has issues with respect to voting. Maybe you don't get to vote it during the vesting period. They could have restrictions on distributions. Usually what they would do is they may escrow the distributions during the vesting schedule and make sure you fully earned it before they pay it out, okay, in restricted stock. They also have restrictions on transferability, typically. Can't transfer it to anybody during the vesting period. Okay, so that's why they call it restricted stock. From a tax standpoint, it's the same as what we're outlining here. No real magic to it.
Does that also mean, David, that you can have in your partnership agreement or your LLC agreement?
These are corporation stock.
So you're switched over to corporation.
Yeah, stock. We're talking about stock grant. Anybody else? So the company, let's look at the company side. The company does get a deduction in this case, right? Because employee paid tax on $5,000, so the company is going to get an offsetting deduction too, $5,000. Okay. Okay, stock options, and we'll move along. Try to get this figured out. Two types of stock options. I've already said that. Non-qualified, qualified being the ISO. So the tax code defines a non-qualified stock option as any option that doesn't meet the definition of an ISO. Yeah, that surprised you with the tax code, right? I mean, it's crazy. So here's what it looks like. So you grant somebody an option. You set a strike price. That's the price set at the fair market value of the stock on the date of the grant. Years ago, they used to do what they called discounted stock options. Well, that went out the window, I think in 2004. And now they require that that the strike price be set at the fair market value on the date of the grant. If you don't do that, there's a crazy code section called IRS code section called 409 capital A, and it says if it's not granted at the fair market value, then the employee, again, they heard the consequences all on the employee, will have to pay a 20% penalty in addition to the income they're going to pay on it. Okay, so that's a bad day. So anybody that starts talking about giving somebody a discount on a non-qualified stock option, not the way to go. It's not in the employee's best interest. It would appear maybe that is. Oh, I get it at a lower value while you're going to get whacked with this 20% penalty. Right? So how's the tax work? There's no tax on the grant of an option because it wasn't a present transfer. Okay? Again, you can't file an 83B election because no present transfer. You're taxed when you exercise it. Okay? So I got a strike price at $100 a share, and and I sell it at $200 a share, I got a $100 spread. That's what I pay the tax on the year that I exercise, and it's all ordinary income, actually compensation income. Okay? Again, the company gets a deduction because I had to pay some tax. If the employee's paying tax, the company's getting a deduction. ISO, incentive stock option. Incentive stock option is a defined term in the Internal Revenue Code. It has some qualification, but let's talk about what's different from ISO to NSO, right? Okay. Same thing you said, a stock price, a strike price has to be a fair market value. But here's the thing, no tax on exercise. If you meet the qualifications, we'll get the qualification. No tax on exercise. The tax will be incurred when you sell it. Okay? And there'll be some potential to get
And when you sell the stock.
When you
right?
sell the stock.
stock that you've already acquired.
And there'll be a potential there to get long-term capital gain on that sale of that stock, whereas in the non-qualified stock option, at least as in the initial go where you exercise, you pay that spread immediately on tax on that spread, ordinary income. So potential to get long-term capital gain here. But here's one caveat on no tax on exercise, year of exercise. An incentive stock option is included in the alternative minimum tax. Are you guys familiar with the alternative minimum tax formula? So you punch that in, to the system and see if it punches up a bigger number. It would be that same number, the spread between the strike price and the value at exercise would be an item for alternative minimum tax. So it could cause you to pay more tax in year of exercise because of the alternative minimum tax. Okay, so here's how you get a long-term capital gain. Before I get to qualifications in this, there's a couple rules. You have that 1 year holding period, long-term capital gain holding period, but there's also an additional rule that you can't dispose of it within 2 years of the grant date. So let's say you grant it today and you exercise it a year from now. You would want to wait another year, and then you would have this 2 year from the grant and also your 1 year long-term capital gain holding period to qualify for the long-term capital gain. But here's the problem with all these darn stock options. Nobody ever exercises them in the private sector. I mean, in the public sector where you have a market for the stock, you could exercise this stuff. In the private sector, nobody exercises. We've done a number of stock plans for clients, and they've had some really nice exits. And typically, the employee initially is pretty okay with it. They still got a big chunk of money. They exercise right before the sale. They got a big, they've got a nice payday. But every single April next, we get calls. Huh? I got to pay what on this? Ordinary income, compensation income, because you didn't have the holding period. Nobody ever gets the holding period. You could, okay, but most people want to wait and see, right? They don't want to put their money into exercise until they know there's going to be a day where they get paid off real quick. So there, if you go and Google, options, everybody, they're the best, right? They're great, but everybody's getting ordinary income on those. I think you could, I think you're better off with the stock grant early in the deal when the company's hardly worth anything, right? Very early. That's where you could get a little more bang for your buck with a restricted stock grant. Go ahead, Harold.
So in the public sector, you can take an offset position, with buying puts or something on a publicly traded stock, but that would affect your holding period in terms of some of your stock options.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So in a public company that's publicly traded,
Right.
if you had stock options, for instance, you could buy on the options exchange. And
Yeah.
put options, basically lock in your downside.
Yeah.
But
Because you got a ready market there to liquidate your interest, right?
right. So do you ever see anything written in terms of some type of synthetic or arrangement in the private sector? In the time we've been working here in Eugene, I don't think we've had a single company go public. Okay,
had a lot of great exits by acquisition here. And frankly, how many people have gone public out of Eugene? I mean, companies.
But they're
Anybody know?
not required by publicly traded companies.
Yes.
Yeah, but then you would.
Peterbilt Pipe maybe?
Okay, so you're saying you're acquired by a publicly traded company.
Right, let's say molecular probes.
Yeah.
You know,
Mhm.
for instance, by a company like Invitrogen, it could have been potentially,
Yeah, then you would have that market available too. But typically what people do on an acquisition that they have these accelerations of their options on sale. So it accelerates what they call, I don't know if you guys heard this, double trigger acceleration. Trigger 1, we've sold the majority of the business. Trigger 2, they let me go. Okay? They fired me, they laid me off. If those two things happen, usually you get to accelerate your vesting and sell your stock. Yes, Al?
I have to ask, sorry. So when you were talking about NSO and ISO, you were talking about the strike price on NSO, and the strike price is the price at the point that it's been granted.
That day of the grant.
Okay. And so that is also the time of exercising.
No, you can,
No.
whatever the option provides on the exercise period, the option could provide for, I'll have to say, you almost typically see 10-year vesting. 10-year option, right?
So basically what you have is you have strike price, exercise price, sale price.
Yeah. So here's the qualifiers here's how to be an ISO. Employees only. You can't grant an ISO to a board of one of your board members or you're an advisor. It has to be an employee. Okay? It
Right,
also,
you can't, right,
go ahead.
no, never mind.
It also has to be the strike price also has to be fair market value. Okay? It has to be, you have to grant these ISOs pursuant to a plan. And that plan has to specially identify how many shares can be issued as ISO. Okay? And then your shareholders have to approve that. And if your shareholders don't approve it, you can't grant ISOs. NSO, typically a board of directors in a corporation has the authority to grant that type of option. Shareholders really have much, unless they have some really strict articles of incorporation or bylaws, invariably has the authority to do that, not the ISO. And when I say they have to authorize, not each award, but the pool of shares that are available for grants under the ISO. So generally, they would set aside, and we have X millions of shares that we're identifying that could be issued as ISO. Okay. You could usually then the board decides who they grant those to. Any questions on that?
Oh, that's a lot of info, right?
Wow, went deep.
So what we've tried to do tonight is, again, go over in broad strokes the ways that you might grant equity, what the tax considerations are, what the securities law considerations are. Right, we haven't gone into, okay, you probably feel like we've gone into a lot of detail, but right, there's actually more nuance to it than that. So what we're hoping you're leaving here actually with tonight are two things. One, understanding that it's a pretty technical area, right? And it's good to get advice before you do this stuff, right? So before you go granting equity to folks, talk to a lawyer, talk to an accountant, right? Talk to somebody who's done this before, so that you understand what the requirements are. And okay, so maybe this isn't a second point. Don't try it on your own, right? So I know people go to LegalZoom to form their LLCs or their corps or whatever. I think they don't go do a great job of that, but you'd be better off using LegalZoom for that than for this, right? And the problem is because it's just not going to be tailored to your company's specific circumstances, right? And you're just not going to have a chance for sort of back and forth to get some advice about it. So this isn't sort of there are some do-it-yourself areas in the law. I think this is not one of them. Any other questions? Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us to do that.